Is this one on? Yeah. Well, a very good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this launch of Poverty in Scotland. I literally just had to check which year it was, 2025, I'm assured. Before we get going into our event and present some of the main findings of the report, as is, I think, traditional now, I'm going to ask Peter Kelly of the Poverty Alliance, who I'm sure you all know, just to basically get Challenge Poverty Week started. So, Peter.
Thanks very much, Chris. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be back here at the launch of what is always a critical part of Challenge Poverty Week, a really important moment to start the week off. But before we get into the detail of Poverty in Scotland 2025, I just wanted to reflect on why we're here. So we started, Poverty Alliance started Challenge Poverty Week back in 2013. Why did we do that? We wanted to highlight not just the impact of poverty. We didn't want to just produce a range of reports saying how difficult things are. We wanted to highlight what communities were doing to tackle poverty. And just remember the times that we're in then. So back in 2013, we're at early doors of austerity, we're at early doors of a massive programme of so-called welfare reform that we're still dealing with the consequences of today. The language at that time was of strivers and skivers. We were in a hostile environment for people who were coming to this country, but also for people who were trying to claim their entitlements. So Challenge Poverty Week was about setting out a different kind of vision. It was about identifying the things that really were, in our view, sources of hope. There were examples of compassion, of kindness, of solidarity. That's what we wanted to focus on when we launched Challenge Poverty Week. But it wasn't just about celebrating kindness or celebrating resilience that we find in communities. It was also about identifying the scale of the challenge that we still have in this country and identifying solutions to poverty in Scotland. What we wanted to do was to move from some of those personal experiences of poverty, some of those examples of resilience and people facing down poverty in their communities, to what we needed with regards to systemic change, to the comprehensive change we need to tackle poverty. What we've learned over those 11, 12 years is that if we're going to make change, we need to speak in unison. We need to speak with greater force. And it's clear for us that real change happens when we stand together. And that's why this year we've also launched Scotland Demands Better, which I'm sure many of you in this room know about or signed up to support. But we think we did that this year because it's an important year. It's an important year because this is a year that we're drafting in Scotland the new Child Poverty Delivery Plan, the plan that should set out the route map for us to reach those really important child poverty targets in 2030. It's also the year that the UK government will set out a new child poverty strategy for the first time in many, many years. So we have those opportunities, those two very specific opportunities for us to engage with governments in Scotland and at UK level to say what we're going to do different to tackle poverty. But I think the other part of the context is the divisive and harmful rhetoric that's around at the moment. Again, that is probably quite reminiscent of a lot of the rhetoric that was around in 2013 when we started Challenge Poverty Week. But Scotland Demands Better is about focusing on the things that we all need: a warm, safe home, a decent income to cover the essentials, healthcare, good schools for our children, support to live a decent and dignified life in older age or if we have health problems or disability. It's about providing an alternative to a lot of what we see in our social media feeds, what we hear on the airwaves at the moment, that what we have now is as good as it can get. We know that we can do a lot better. So Joseph Rowntree's report today shows how far we still have to go. It shows some of those elements where progress has been made and that we need to build on that. But it also shows that real positive change is possible. But to secure that change, We need to stand together and demand it. So I really hope that all of you in this room, all of you online today, will join us in Edinburgh on the 25th of October to march and rally against poverty and to demand better in Scotland. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Sorry, I should have said at the beginning, we're not expecting any fire alarms, but if we do hear one, the fire exits are at the back of the room. Just before we hear from Carla on the main findings of the report, I just wanted to take 5 minutes to give some of my thoughts. And firstly, thank you, Peter, for the work that you and all your colleagues at the Poverty Alliance do every Challenge Poverty Week. And that's no less of a mean feat given all the work you're doing on Scotland Demands Better as well. Because this year's Challenge Poverty Week really does come at a crucial time. We're about to go into one of the most consequential Holyrood elections in a long time. Many will argue this is because of insurgent political parties or a referenda on the performance of either or both of the UK or Scottish governments. And of course, in many ways, that's true. But the core of that is the level of public dissatisfaction with our economy and political system. People are feeling overlooked and ignored. Many would put it a heck of a lot more strongly than that. And this is the major challenge that our parties face in the run-up to next May's election, how to win back the trust of the people who live and work in Scotland. Not just for the purposes of their own electoral success, but for the strength of our political systems and social cohesion. Politics can get a bad name, and sometimes very well earned, but when politics brings hope and connection, countries can thrive, and we can, as Peter's already said, do so much better here. So what is the route back to that connection and prosperity? It may not be entirely surprising to you that we think that route is through the findings of today's report. The fact that so many people, still almost 1 in 4 children, are struggling to get by. Carla will take you through the detail of that in a moment, so I won't repeat the main findings just now. But in some ways, some of the headline findings are quite easy to remember because they've not shifted that much in recent years. But we are starting to see some of the seeds of hope. The Scottish Child Payment, I think, is having an impact. We see child poverty falling in most local authority areas in Scotland, but we should be so much further on. And the Scottish Government's priority families continue to stretch the meaning of priority beyond credibility. I think we need to do 2 things as a sector. Acknowledge the wins that have been made between the Scottish Child Payment, the reforms to adult disability payment, the commitment to abolish the 2-child limit. We've secured billions of pounds of additional investment for the people who need it the most. And we can't ignore that the child poverty reduction targets have been crucial in delivering that change. But we must push all the parties standing in next year's election to raise their ambition and the scale of their plans, insofar as they have plans at all. We have to keep pushing on housing, support for work, better public services, the adequacy of social security. And we set out earlier this year in our Meeting the Moment publication the sort of scale of action that is needed. And we can't and shouldn't ignore that this requires big changes to force us to have big debates about the level of taxes we pay, how we pay taxes. It's bin the council tax, for example, whether we can pay for further expenses of childcare with greater contributions from wealthier families. We have to get into these debates because the alternative is this it? Is this the best we can do in Scotland? Has Scotland reached its nadir? Surely not. So just as importantly, we need to keep pushing the vision of the country that meeting the child poverty targets would deliver. In many ways, the numbers related to these targets are meaningless. Someone's life doesn't change if they're a pound above or below the relative poverty line. But meeting these targets would speak to something far more important, of the Scottish Government and Parliament genuinely turning all of their sights on transforming the lives of people in Scotland, not maintaining the status quo, not tweaking around the edges, genuinely delivering changing investments today that build a better future for us all. If that's not what the Scottish Parliament is for, What is it for? These targets can't just be another platitude that was delivered without the action to back them up, because there are malign forces waiting in the wings to push stories of division that feast on the insecurity that unites so many while trying to drive a wedge between those at the hardest edges of our society. We can and must believe in a better Scotland, and all of our politicians going into next year's election have the responsibility to deliver one. So we hope today's report can provide a bit of additional motivation for those politicians to act, and our event today a bit of a chance to gather our own thoughts on what we see in the next Parliament. The next wee while will be a big test for us all, but I'm sure we can rise to it. And let's hope, no, let's demand that our politicians do so too. Okay, thank you. So now, that really brings us to the meat of what you're going to hear from us this morning. I'd like to introduce our lead analyst, Carla Sabula, who has put an absolute mountain of incredible work into this report. So thank you so much, Carla, and I'll leave you in her very able hands.
Thanks. Okay. So this is just the agenda for today for anyone that's not seen it. Okay. So before presenting the findings from this year's report, I wanted to stress that a better Scotland where all children can thrive is possible. Earlier this year, we did some modelling of different policy solutions, and we found that with a mix of bold social security and work interventions, we could meet the child poverty reduction targets. These policies must be both broad, like increasing the Scottish child payment, and targeted, like supporting disabled people into work. While some of the findings from this year's report are worrying, it is important to remember that this other future is possible. So first, a quick overview of what we found this year before we go into the details. Poverty rates and child poverty rates have seen little progress. There was a slight rise over the COVID-19 pandemic, and rates are almost back to where they were before then. While there are some signs that the Scottish child payment is having an impact, there has not been substantial progress. Within this, we also see some of the troubling patterns that we've highlighted in previous years. Very deep poverty remains high. 1 in 10 people in Scotland have an income below 40% of the median. In-work poverty also remains high, with nearly 3/4 of children in poverty having a parent in work. And housing and social security remain drivers of poverty when both could and should be solutions. So 2 in 5 people in families in receipt of a low-income benefit, like universal credit, are in poverty, while 1 in 10 renters are pulled into poverty because of their housing costs. So the focus of this year's report is the priority families. So some of the key findings from this year are children in the priority families continue to have a higher risk of poverty than all children in Scotland. Nearly 9 in 10 children in poverty are in a priority family. Child poverty rates have increased for minority ethnic families, large families, and families with a baby since 2017 when the targets were introduced. And being in multiple priority families increases your risk of being in poverty even more. So before going any further, I just wanted to remind everyone who the priority families are. So they're large families, single-parent families, families with a baby, families with a young mother, minority ethnic families, and families where someone's disabled. We don't include any analysis of families with a young mother because that group is just really small. But when we look over intersecting groups, we do include them as one of the groups that can overlap. So in 2021, we also focused our Poverty in Scotland report on the priority families. At the time, Alex, who's one of our End Poverty Scotland group, told us, if over 80% of children in poverty are in one of the priority groups, how big a priority are we really? So Alex is a parent in multiple priority groups, and she's the longest standing member of the End Poverty Scotland group. This year, we're focusing on the priority families again, looking at where we are now and considering whether the priority families are the priority that they should be. As I go through the findings of the report, I want you to keep Alex's words in your mind. So nearly 9 in 10 children in poverty are now in one of the priority families or in multiple priority families. This is a slight rise since our report in 2021. Children in the priority families continue to have higher rates of poverty than all children. While risk of poverty is important in understanding where we might want to focus, it's also important to understand what children make up the biggest groups of children in poverty. So the chart here shows both the risk of poverty, or the poverty rate, in dark blue, and the share or composition of child poverty in green. Children in minority ethnic families have the highest rate of poverty, with nearly half of children in minority ethnic families in poverty. And this is double the rate that's found for all children. This is closely followed by children in large families, with more than 2 in 5 in poverty. Although poverty rates are closer to those seen for all children, children in households where someone is disabled make up over half of children in poverty. And in families with a baby, they make up a smaller proportion of children in poverty, but every child passes through this group, so it's a really important policy point where people can support families. So these findings just re-emphasise the need for action that supports the priority families. If we don't do this, we're never going to significantly reduce child poverty and definitely not going to meet the child poverty reduction targets. So now we're going to have a look at poverty trends over time for the priority families. All of the priority families have lower poverty rates now than they did 30 years ago. And looking over the entire period, the group with the biggest fall is single-parent families. The decline in poverty from the mid-90s to around 2010 should remind us all that prioritising reducing child poverty can have an impact. Children in minority ethnic families only have a trend starting in 2001. For this group, we see a similar child poverty rate now as then. And then if we look at that same period for the other priority families, we see a similar pattern for families with a baby and large families. The poverty rate for children in minority ethnic families has also risen steeply since 2014-17. And as I mentioned earlier, of real concern is that the poverty rate has risen for families with a baby, large families and minority ethnic families since the child poverty reduction targets were introduced. For large families, it is blatantly clear that the 2-child limit is a key driver of worsening poverty for this group. This brutal policy needs to end, and we mean end, not be tweaked. And if we don't do that, poverty will continue to rise for children in large families. So we also looked at the overlap between the priority families. Sometimes, when we think about policy solutions, we can look at the priority families as distinct groups. But in reality, more than half of children in poverty are in 2 or more of the priority families. And we also found that this has been growing over recent years. The parents that we spoke to also told us that they didn't feel they neatly fitted into one group. They told us that the barriers that affect them change over time, making their belonging to a certain priority group more or less important. For example, a father of 3, one of their children is disabled, told us how his son's disability has become a bigger worry for him as he approaches adulthood. He's worried about how he will manage with the support he has when his son is not in school. Now, we couldn't look at specific overlaps like single-parent large families because the sample sizes are too small. But we did find that children in 2 or more priority groups have a poverty rate 4 times the rate of children that are in none of the priority groups. And we also saw that they have much higher and increasing rates of deep and very deep poverty. Well, as I said, we couldn't look at the more detailed intersectional groups. We did find that some children in the priority families are more likely to be in other or multiple groups. So that would mean, for example, they were in that priority family plus 1 or more other priority families. So we found this was particularly the case for children in large families and minority ethnic families. For example, only 1/4 of children in large families are only in that priority group. 3/4 are also in at least one other priority group. Okay. So I'm coming back to the words of Alex, but Alex now, 4 years on. When she saw the analysis for this year, her thoughts so closely reflect how she felt 4 years ago. She said, "The phrase priority families feels empty when the poverty rate for many within them is still increasing." As Chris said, people in Scotland are feeling overlooked and ignored by decision makers, and parents in the priority families are no exception. The lack of progress is leaving parents feeling left behind, but they also know that it is possible for their children to have a better future, but governments need to take the right actions now. Okay, so the final part of the report looks at the key barriers for the priority families. Now, many of the barriers that all parents face and the solutions that would help them are those that are magnified for parents in the priority families. And our analysis highlighted some key areas in work and social security. We analysed the most common family work patterns for the priority families. Where possible, we also looked at children in poverty within the priority families and all children within the priority families, because we know that work patterns differ for households in poverty and households not in poverty. Some families were more likely to have one parent in work, and for these families, getting a second parent into work could really make all the difference to their household income. This was most common for minority ethnic families and large families compared to all children. For other families, it's much more likely that no parent in work, and this is most prevalent for single parent families, where it's just much more challenging to juggle childcare and employment. For these families, getting support into flexible and suitable employment is what is required. Too many parents are locked out of the labour market. They're unable to reach their potential due to a lack of affordable, accessible and flexible childcare and good flexible jobs. And social security, it drives poverty in two ways. For some families, the inadequacy of the social security system is leaving their incomes far too low. We know that single parents, large families and families where someone is disabled are more likely to be in receipt of a low-income benefit. But even with these benefits, they're still being left in poverty. For others, take-up is the issue, with lower proportions of families taking up the benefits that we would expect. For example, minority ethnic families have a very high poverty rate, yet a much lower than expected take-up of social security. Building trust between institutions and communities of colour is critical if we want to see better take-up of the benefits that families are entitled to. Zane from the End Poverty Scotland group highlighted the way that people feel when they're interacting with these systems. He said, "People are scared to ask for help in case what they've got is taken away from them." We also see that children in disabled households in poverty are less likely than disabled families not in poverty to be in receipt of a disability benefit. As disability benefits are intended to cover the additional costs of a disability, this means that these families are covering these costs from their already inadequate incomes. And finally, for families with a baby, there is a complex system to navigate across the first year of their child's life. This can include being reliant on statutory maternity pay, early years childcare, employer goodwill, and trying to access low-income benefits. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Chris and our excellent panel today to hear their thoughts on the findings from the report, but also more about what they hope to see over the next Parliament.
Well, thank you so much, Carla, as always. And so I'm delighted now to be joined by, I'll announce them in the order they sit down, Russell Gunson, who's the Head of Programmes and Practice from the Robertson Trust, Shoal McPherson, a Policy and Research Officer from CREER, and Tressa Burke, the CEO of the Glasgow Disability Alliance. So what we're going to do over the next hour or so, we're going to take the first half of that to hear from our amazing panel, to hear some of their reflections on the report. And then there'll be a chance for everyone in the room to ask questions, either of the panel or of Carla and our colleagues about some of the content of the report. And there's a chance, I think, for people who are online to post questions there too. But I'll maybe start with you, Tressa. What are your reflections on the report? What does it make you think?
Okay, so I've got quite a lot of reflections. So my first one is that I'm not surprised at all by the specific finding and the fact that the priority state is given to disabled families in words because there has been no actions at all. So we've been hearing about this for years, that disabled families are one of the priorities, but there are no actions corresponding to that. They would either tackle the symptoms and the issues faced by disabled families, like deep and long-term poverty, or the root causes of poverty and inequalities faced, like the way the economy is rigged to benefit the rich, inadequate social security benefits, poor and inadequate and inaccessible public services, and of course the growing sense of the self and individualisation in relation to the public and political attitudes, and the current anti-disability rhetoric and prejudice, which I think everybody would agree is flying high amongst other right-wing views at this time. As with parents mentioned in the report, disabled people not only feel overlooked by decision makers, but they feel they've very little influence on decisions being made which affect them, and they've got exceptionally low levels of trust in all layers of government. And this massive democratic deficit has been reflected in a survey that we've just completed with 756 disabled people, that's shown that 57% of respondents feel they've got no influence in decision making in their local area. 52% feel they've got no influence in Scotland at a Scotland level, and 76% feel they've got no influence at a UK level. And there's corresponding findings in levels of trust, with 64% of participants reporting low trust level in local authorities, 54% in Scottish Government, and 86 having a low level of trust in the UK Government. So it's obviously a really awful time with people just not trusting the politicians. Now, this is all directly related to the fact that disabled people are either living with staggering health inequalities, and inequalities generally meaning poorer life outcomes across a whole range of area, or they're dying younger, dying by health inequalities, or in some cases, and really tragically, dying by suicide. And there's evidence from the UN about that, and I'll not go into that because there's not really time just now. A couple other thoughts from me, sorry. I'm just going to fly through some more thoughts. So the impact of all of this is that disabled people feel brutalised and frightened, and these are words that people use. They really do feel brutalised, often by their interaction with services, would you believe, and in particular with social work services and social care, which is terrible because that was a word that was saved really for DWP interactions, and now we're applying it to local authority service delivery. They tell us they feel devalued by society and forgotten by politicians, and particularly abandoned by the UK government. And I think that we all saw what happened earlier this year. Yes, earlier this year with the UK government Green Paper and the attack on disability benefits. Now, I had a whole list of stats, but I'm not going to go through them, so I'm just going to pick a couple out. So 96% in our survey, that's 756 disabled members of GDA, are concerned about benefits or potential benefits cuts, and 82% say that the benefits that they get do not cover the full cost of being disabled. 75% can't afford to socialise more than rarely, and we gave the option of, weekly, fortnightly, monthly, or occasionally, and people were choosing occasionally, which is really, that was quite a shocking finding for ourselves. 85% reported concerns about access to services, and 75% said that where they did need or use social care, their needs were not being met by that. 89% of people really worried about their mental health, and I don't think that would be any surprise to anybody here. I'm not going to read all these stats. 91% of people said they're worried about disabled people's equality and human rights, and that's an interesting finding, I think it is because of the rhetoric of the far right being on the rise, but also because there's a general sense of disabled people being under attack by that Green Paper, and we're not out of the woods yet with that, although that was a great win to get them to back down at that point, but also the Human Rights Bill being pulled or paused in Scotland, being put into the too difficult to manage pile, and recently, very recently, the Disability Commissioner Bill being pulled also by Jeremy Corbyn because there was no political support for it. So I'm going to tell you what I think would help. How much time have I got? This first thing isn't very sexy, but it is absolutely necessary. So the Scottish Government, the local authorities and the UK Government need to do better in their understanding of disabled people, and we call that disability equality competence. Not sexy, not something that's going to change disabled people's lives overnight, but absolutely necessary to make good policies and to do something about the implementation gap. The bigger thing would be to invest in social security benefits so that they're adequate, and investing also in public services, in particular services that disabled people are very reliant on to live a dignified life and a life of meaning and choices, so health and social care being right up there. But disabled people also need not just money from social security, but also fair work and access to work as well, which includes access to work scheme, which is under attack by the UK Government as well. There's already been cuts, and we heard last week that the Minister had signed off a paper where he denied doing anything of the kind right up until he was exposed on it last week, saying that he wanted more scrupulous implementation access to work, whatever that means. So that's a programme that helps disabled people who are in work. I get access to work support, as do many GDA staff. So access to work, access adjustments in work, social security benefits, tailored employment support that actually helps disabled people and meets their needs, and also each government, at a local, national and UK level, having a plan for disabled people. So we already have one in Scotland. That's something positive. We can build on that. We'd like to see that around the UK and at local levels as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Teresa. One thing I should say as well is we've been doing a bit of work with you and the Scottish Women's Budget Group on social care charging in particular, and on disabled people's poverty, which should be out in the next few weeks. So do keep your eyes peeled for that. Sholin, maybe ask you the same question. What are your reflections on the report?
So similarly with Teresa, I got to say that I was really, really happy to see the priority focus again, because I think it's in the first paragraph, the so-called priority families, because as Alex rightly said, how can it be a priority family when it's increasing? Like, minority ethnic poverty is higher now than it was before, 47%. If you half this room and then shift it a little bit, almost 1 in 2. It's horrifying. Horrifying, sorry, that's a very, very strong word that I should not be using our the word's going on my head, sorry, guidance from Save the Children JRF. Which everyone should read. But it's really, really stark numbers, really, really stark sort of stats here. Sorry, I've gone right off. But very, very happy to the priority focus, because things just are not currently getting that much better. And we really, really need them to get much, much better. But there was a decrease. It was 53% last year for minority families. Now it's 47%. So the progress is very much possible, but it is going to require a lot. It is going to require investment. So I think I've skipped part 2 of the question. It is going to require investment. It's going to require a targeted focus, because you do not reduce something down from double the rate just through the mainstream policies, general policies. It's not going to happen, unfortunately. So I would really, really, really welcome much more focused action, much more targeted action for minority ethnic people, because this is a system that is not working. This is a system that where 1 in 3 minority ethnic families live in a household with someone who's accessing universal credit or a similar legacy benefit. Even though 50%, same rate as all children, despite again double the rate of poverty, people are not accessing the benefits that they need. And it isn't just because, and obviously there are things like stigma. Is a really, really huge issue in terms of take-up, but also it's a system that is not working. It's a system that is actively excluding people. Black people in Scotland are more likely to be sanctioned. BME people in Scotland are much more likely to be on the most intrusive, most intensive regime, conditionality regimes of universal credit. And that's a system that it pushes people into into very poor quality jobs, low wage jobs typically, that they do not pay you enough to live on. They trap you in jobs in which you have to consistently continue to rely on these benefits, and it is so counterproductive. And it's again a sign of a system that is punishing some people to avoid having to put forward policies that make everyone's lives better. There are so many parts of the system where Black minority people in Scotland and in the UK have their outcomes just are not where they should be. And we cannot accept those things because it feels like it happens to a smaller, a smaller amount of the population, or some people's views that population isn't as deserving of that support. But as the report rightly notes, 1 in 10 children in Scotland are black minority ethnic, and 1 in 5 children in poverty are BME, are minority ethnic. But it's not a niche issue. It's 1 in 5 children in poverty are minority ethnic. And if the mainstream policies are not reaching them, we need to make sure that those policies are now reaching those children and that we are having that progress. Because until now, this is the first year where that number's gone down, if I'm right. I'd have to ask Carla, but I believe this is the first year since the targets has gone down at all for minority ethnic families. And that isn't acceptable. But I think the lowest the number's ever been is 39%. If the numbers are recorded. Sorry, I'm looking at Chris, but I won't expect him to know that off the top of his head. But so the report is brilliant, thank you. But it's just frustrating again because we continue to see that there hasn't been the level of progress needed, there isn't the investment needed, there isn't the resource needed, and we need to be able to commit that. We need to really actively think about what it is that we are doing, because I'll read impact assessment over and over again and it will just say, more likely to be in poverty, as such, positive impact. And it doesn't look at all of these factors. It doesn't look at the fact that minority ethnic people are twice as likely to be in insecure work. They're twice as likely to be underemployed, not working as many hours as they want and not working in a job that matches their qualifications. BME people in Scotland BME sort of students are actually more likely to go into university. But then graduates are getting, they're more likely to be unemployed and their wages are lower. There are so many of these sort of disparities that show a really, really broken system. And so many of the solutions, like sort of fixing a lot of the things with universal credit, are solves that will benefit all of us, but they will disproportionately address those issues. So I think I answered that kind of backwards, but that's lovely.
Great, thanks so much. And last but by no means least, Russell.
Oh, I don't know about that, but thank you. And I think first reflection is just what an amazing piece of work. Again, we sort of get used to this every year, but Carla and the rest of the JRF team, first reflection is that it is a phenomenal piece of work. I think I'm not going to touch on priority families, but I think the data in there is both shocking and incredibly interesting and powerful. And equally, the local level statistics, have a look. If you're a policy nerd like me, you will enjoy them. My reflections, I think, are that there are reasons to be hopeful and there are reasons to be fearful from what's in the report. So on the surface, it looks like poverty is stuck again for 4 years and more and counting. At the level at child poverty and more broadly at poverty rates across Scotland feels the same, despite all of the effort that we're all putting in across many years to try and shift it. And the reason to be fearful is that underneath that stuck picture is actually that there are things getting worse, not just that we've heard already, but around very deep poverty and around working poverty. Those stats continue to show a trend of getting worse this year and has been getting worse for a number of years. So reasons to be fearful are that underneath that stuck sort of first impression is that actually it's worse than that for many. And you've heard in terms of priority groups that it's worse than that for really important parts of our population too. But the reasons to be hopeful, I think, are that underneath that stuck picture are some really positive things. I think you can see the Scottish Child Payment beginning to feed through into the statistics, but who cares about the numbers? It's feeding through into people's lives. It's making a difference to children and their families. And we can be incredibly proud as a group of people here, arguably as a country, that we've got that investment, we've got that massive prize right. And equally, other reasons to be positive are that whilst it's stuck in Scotland, child poverty and poverty more broadly is getting far, far worse across the rest of the UK. So whilst our aim is not to be better than the rest of the UK, we do need to give credit to ourselves and to those decision makers that have made the right decisions, that we are not getting worse when the headwinds against us are significantly strong. So to me, I think we have to be hopeful. We have to protect the wins, the prizes that we have as a group of people won over the last 5 years and then some. If we're not proud of them, if we're not protecting them, who will? whilst also challenging our politicians to do much, much more, and challenging ourselves too over this next 5 years to at least secure the wins that we've done over the last 5 years again. So I'll stop there in terms of report reflections, but again, to me, there's reasons to be pessimistic, but lots of reasons to be optimistic.
Well, I'll maybe try and pull us out of your pool of pessimism there, Russell. I mean, Sholin's referred to the report which was published last week by colleagues with Save the Children on changing the story around child poverty. And one of the really important findings from that, and it's partly why there aren't any politicians here today, is we wanted to kind of focus this on the kind of us as Scotland demanding better, as it were. But one of the things in that is that feeling of people being overlooked and ignored by politics, by feeling naffed off, however we want to put it. But we cannot leave it there. If we leave it there, we are just getting further down that hole. So I think part of our task is to try and build some of that trust back, bring in a belief in change, a momentum for change. So I think that this kind of second round of reflections would be great to hear from you. Is like, what for you do you want to see in the next Parliament? Yes, we've got these targets coming, but we're also in difficult times. How do we re-inject a bit of life into our Parliament, and most importantly, change people's lives in Scotland for the better? What would you want to see? Why don't we just go back in the same order? We'll start with you, Tress.
So I kind of covered some of this already, but I mean, a very obvious thing, if you were to do one thing for disabled people, it would be increase social security benefits, so that they cover they were adequate to cover the extra costs, and in parallel with that you would have fair work. But I mean, none of these things are simple, so particularly the work thing, because people face barriers to work. Social care is a barrier to work, transport's a barrier to work, the fact that disabled people don't do as well in educational attainment, and that's often because of barriers as well. So there are complex interrelated things that need to be addressed, which is why I was saying a plan would actually really help with that. But definitely, if there was one thing, it would be increasing the social security benefits. But another thing for disabled people is stop taking money off them. Please stop taking social care charges off them. This elastic ADP or PIP or DLA, whatever version it was not ever intended for the purposes of paying social care. It was intended that if you needed care, that was the criteria to get the benefit, but not that you would then use the money to buy what was a free local authority service at that point. And so stopping taking the money off people as well. And there's lots of ways, like public sector debt, which are sometimes rolled up in social care charges as well. So I think it's not just one thing, but the benefits, the work, the extra costs, and stopping charging people would be a great start.
Okay, thank you, Sholin.
So again, agreeing with Tressa, social security would be a really, really big thing, because again, it's just, people are not claiming the amount that you would expect given the poverty, and the amount that they're getting, this is sort of going back to last year's JRF report, but the amount that people are getting from benefits is also halved over, from 2023 to 1995, 98, sorry, Carla, I'm talking about numbers wrong, but it's halved. It's income from social security has got so much lower, and it's happened for lots of people, but it's really, really happened for minority ethnic groups. Their income has dropped. They've been hit the hardest by some of these cuts. So I would really, really emphasise the role of social security. I would also really emphasise the role of housing as well, because it's so expensive, and I think that's something that quite a lot of people experience. But again, BME groups have really concentrated in the private rental sector, and rent has skyrocketed. I know personally, looking at the numbers as well, it's so much higher than it used to be. And in Scotland traditionally, lower housing costs were something kind of insulated Scotland to an extent from poverty. But that just isn't the case anymore. And so many people are now just having to pay more than a third of their income on housing. I think it's 1 in 10, and it's 1 in 5 for minority ethnic. Sorry. I shouldn't be quoting numbers I don't know, but...
Can you put the mic?
Oh, sorry. Right. But housing costs are just, they're far too unaffordable for far too many people. So I would really, really emphasise the role of, investing in that affordable housing, and sort of targeting that policy can be more difficult, but we do know there are pockets of Scotland where minority ethnic groups are more likely to live, and where housing deprivation is amongst the worst in Scotland. So, kind of targeting that on a local level would be really, really good. But so just more generally, I said it in my last answer, but we really, really do need to invest in action. We're not going to get there by accident. We really need careful consideration of targeted policies and focused policies, and that will differ from group to group. I know we're using minority ethnic here, but different groups do experience different barriers. And within your own services, if 1 in 5 children in poverty are minority ethnic, does that look like your service base? Does it look like your client base? Why is that? If it isn't, have a look at your local statistic. Is that what your population looks like? Is that a reason why? Is it not? We do need to be, I think, at every level, looking really closely and seeing if our work is benefiting those groups, and if it isn't, what we can be doing to solve that. And then on a more dry point, we need much, much better data, because again, we're looking at aggregated groups here. Different groups have very different outcomes, and obviously that averages out to be 47%, but that means some groups are a lot higher, and we need to know exactly sort of who and why that is. We can get a pretty good idea by looking at UK data, by looking at 10, 12-year, 15-year averages. But if we want to see year to year how people are improving, or maybe things are getting worse, we really, really need much more investment in data and evidence as well. But yeah, just investing, honestly, investing and focusing some of that attention, because if we don't do it, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, just before you answer, Russell, I mean, I think your point on data and on analysis of the populations that particularly public services are supporting is so crucial. People have been complaining about the lack of data for minority ethnic communities for ages, and hee-haw really has been done about it. And like, even from my time in government as well, of that kind of impact assessment, which just said there are more people affected by poverty, so they'll benefit from this policy. It would be the same for disabled people, it'll be same for single parents, etc., etc. It's not done through badness. Some of it is just done because the data is not there. But within services, within third sector organisations, these things are known. We just need to connect that all together a bit better. Russell?
Yeah, I think for me, for the next Parliament, the first thing, almost the overarching thing, is to get parties recommitting or refreshing their commitment to the child poverty targets. There's a real risk that a lack of progress towards them kills them, and we cannot afford for those child poverty targets to die a death. So what can we do to refresh them? And this is the perfect opportunity over the next 6 months to continue that unanimous support that we had, where are we, almost 10 years ago now, across Parliament. Continue that over the next 5 years. And to be honest, I'm not going to, die in a ditch over how you meet those targets, as long as you do. If there's a more work-focused way to do it that the Conservatives and others are interested in, great. If it's more social security, fine. But hit those targets, and recommitting to those targets must be the first thing. For me, I think it would be around social security spend, because over that 5 years, I don't see how you can make significant progress to hitting those targets. Without that, you need more than that, but you do need that. And the Scottish Child Payment, I think looking at some of the really bad holes and gaps in the system across the UK, like the 5-week wait, the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, etc. Looking at what we can do in Scotland through devolved powers to plug those gaps. A bit of work that we were all involved in fact, around the minimum income guarantee, which published in June, set out how you could use those devolved powers to begin to make those first steps towards a guarantee in Scotland, including through devolved powers in those areas. But it's not just social security, so investing in employability, investing in childcare, investing in housing must be part of the mix too. The last thing I would say is that whilst those individual policies and that overall commitment to child poverty targets are important, probably more important than that is a commitment to hope. And that is as much us as decision makers and politicians. So for the next Parliament, I really want us and them to recommit to that hope that we can achieve better than we currently are. It's been name-checked already, but the Change in the Story work that Save the Children and JRF did is a really important part of that. But I think we have to get used to giving credit for the progress that has been made, whilst also being able to challenge around what still needs to be done. And we need to do both, because in these times, above all, we have to fight and protect the wins that we have won. last thing I said was last thing, but we got £650 million extra spend on child poverty over the last 5 years. If we just did that again, we would reduce the child poverty rate by 6 percentage points. That is infinitely achievable. And in fact, if we don't achieve that again, I would argue we are not doing our jobs properly. So there is hope there. There is massive progress to be won over the next 5 years, but we have to get that positive energy back ourselves and infect the politicians with it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the chat we've seen recently from the Parliament in particular about the sustainability of social security spending, which is hard to say, it's so crucial that we fight that extremely hard, because that is part of the othering of social security spending. We often hear about rises in public spending and social security spending as if it's not public spending. That's such an important narrative for us to just attack and attack and attack. And I think as well within things like adult disability payment, we're hearing all the time, oh, the Scottish Government are spending so much more than their block grant on these things. They chose to do that. They were right to do that. I mean, there's a hell of a lot more to do, as you've said, Tressa, but that's the thing, is that people keep talking about increases in social security spending in Scotland as if it was some miasma that came over the budget and has suddenly put it. These were choices that were made, positive choices made by the government and Parliament, supported and pushed for the people in this room. So they're so crucial. Okay, people have been sitting, listening for a long time now. So I think it's probably a good chance to hear some questions from a room or from online. As I say, any of our wonderful panel members will be able to answer questions. I might be able to answer some. If we get into hard numbers, we've got our experts in the corner if we can help us answer some of that. So has anybody in the room got any questions? We do have roving mics. I don't know if somebody could grab, first question is from Idris. It's over
there. Hi, my name's Idris. I'm from GRF Scotland. My question is, how do we stop things from getting to critical stage before the government acts? And obviously the eligibility criteria for different aspects of particularly PIP or social security needs to stop getting to that critical stage. And obviously the criteria for meeting the support that you need, that needs to be lowered so people can be encouraged to do that. How can we encourage that and make sure that it's taken aboard by the politicians and it's not just lip service?
Do you want to go first, Tressa? Yeah.
So a few ideas. I suppose the first thing I would say is in multiple ways. So there's the kind of hard lobbying that we all do, Scotland demands better, the kind of collective action that we all take, and then there's other ways of working with politicians, working with governments, working with people in local authorities, conversations in the room, conversations outside of the room. But I do think that there is hope in the form of us being together, collective action, collective solidarity, people becoming aligned. So one of the things I'm really keen to do is to build a wider movement of support for disability justice so that people understand the reality of disabled people's lives. And you're talking about eligibility for disability benefits and for social care and wider. And we need it not just to be the very small ecosystem of disabled people-led organisations, because there's about 10 in Scotland that, you know, that actually carry any weight, maybe slightly more, but not many. We really need to build that coalition and that movement. And I think we also need to influence the public with these new narratives and new ways of telling stories, because we need them to help us put pressure on government and hold them to account. So that's just a few ideas from me.
I think it's a perfect example as well of when we often hear a lot of like gnashing of teeth about, oh, but the government don't do enough preventative policy. I mean, that's exactly what what you're talking about. I mean, the fact that eligibility has got, as you say, to a point where it has to be kind of critical before any kind of care kicks in, then you might get charged for it as well, is crazy, because it is allowing things to get worse before the state intervenes. And I think, you know, social care is a really good example. Like, another win we've kind of had within the sector is kind of saying that childcare is a vital part in the fight against child poverty for all sorts of reasons. It's good for kids, it's good for parents, all these kind of things. Social care is the same. It should be a preventative policy. It should be a policy which allows disabled people to live the fullest life possible. It shouldn't be an emergency service, and it shouldn't be so hard to get and expensive. So I think trying to reframe in politicians' minds what these services are. I mean, I do think you could say, I mean, social care is the kind of unfinished bit of the welfare state, really. It's never really moved beyond. I used to be a government lawyer, and the social care is still built on the National Assistance Scotland Act 1948. I mean, the first section of it was repealing the Poor Law. I mean, this is how old our social care infrastructure is within the country. It does not match the world we live in today, and it is something that has to change. Got another question at the front here.
Thank you. I may be wrong, but my reading of the Child Poverty Act is that the punishment for not meeting the child poverty target is that the government has to explain in a report why they've not met it. If we get to that point, which we hear warnings year in, year out that we're unlikely to meet the target, it's going to be difficult to meet the target, what can the sector do if it's a 24-hour news cycle, it's a nicely worded report, and the government and the parliament moves on, especially if the next parliament is less child poverty focused, has less of a slant toward agreement on child poverty. If the target isn't met, that report's written, we have the 24-hour news cycle, and then we move on. What do we do after that point, and how do we start to prepare in case we get to that point?
It's an excellent question. Why don't we start with you, Russell?
I'm surprised nobody booed Chris for being an ex-government lawyer, by the way. I think we could...
I booed myself out of it. So.
I think it's a really excellent question. I think the first thing is we don't want to get to that point. And I mean that in multiple ways. So we need to keep those targets alive by meeting them, but also by making progress quickly towards them. Secondly, whilst the power of the target is to some extent, because it's legally binding, the main power is soft. So it's the fact that we all care about it. We are pushing politicians to care about it. It was a unanimous cross-party support for it. So if we get to that point, we've all failed, not just them. And so what I'd say is that we have to push them very hard to make progress over this next 5 years, to make sure that we make that progress, keep them alive. Just to slightly repeat what I said, there is massive opportunity to do so. So it feels really hard just now to see us meeting those targets by 2030. But I can see real big opportunities to make significant progress over the next 5 years. And whilst 10% is very important, and that should be our aim, if we get to 10.1, if we get to 12 or 13%, we've still done something phenomenal, and we should absolutely pat ourselves on the back for that, but also give credit where it's due too. And that is very possible within, as I said earlier, what we have invested over the last 5 years. Do that again, bit of tailwind from the UK government, and what I just described is absolutely within reach.
You don't have to. I mean, I agree with what Russell said as well. There are also other mechanisms out there. I mean, we've got the UNCRC is there. There are a variety of ways in which children's rights are undoubtedly being broken. Part of that is through just the general levels of child poverty, discrimination against disabled children, and, you know, the lack of ASN support within schools and all these kind of things. I think, as Russell said, there are the kind of formal elements of the Act are fine. We don't really want those bits to come in, but I do think that kind of softer power, raising the stakes. I think this election is really important from this perspective, because we need each of the parties to go in with these targets as something which they are making themselves accountable for. Now, there's all sorts of debate around the current First Minister talking about judge me on eradicating poverty, and some people go, oh, well, that's not very clever politics. Who cares whether it is or not? It's an important stake for us to keep pushing on. So I think we need that commitment to remain after the election, because that's how we get to, we've said in our press release today, it is fine for the next government to try really hard and fail to quite get the targets, but it's not acceptable just not to try. And I think that's the thing, is it will be hard from where we stand today. It was hard from 2017. It's always going to have required big radical change over a relatively short period of time, but they can still do it, and we should certainly still push them to do it. That was a really good question. So Carla, and then
I'm bringing in the online questions. So we have a question from Lynn that says, we hear too often that key groups are people at risk of poverty, yet the dial barely moves. Can we really shift the dial on this lack of effective action so that more talk doesn't just alienate people?
Yeah, could you repeat that, Carla? It was hard to pick up.
So I think the question is basically, by focusing on these key groups and not seeing any progress, how can we shift the dial of the lack of effective action, but without alienating people?
So I think there are things that work. There are. There is. If you look at some sort of local authorities and you look at the practice that they've done, there are things that seem to be working really, really well. And it's difficult because, I think there's, often gaps in sort of evaluation and stuff, but you can really see there's sort of financial inclusion, like income maximisation products, say, in terms of, sticking with social security. There are projects that have, they've focused their resource, their financial support inclusion officers, in schools where it was, I think they used targeting based on English as additional language, so it's obviously not a direct proxy for ethnicity or migration or anything like that, but there is, there's a lot of overlap there. And they were able to have such an amazing effect. They were able to get, achieve, I can't think of the number, but a huge amount. There are policies that can do things, and that doesn't, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity, your migration, your language, anything. If you were in one of those schools where there was quite a high level of poverty and there was quite a high level of need, you could have that support. It wasn't taking away from anyone else. It was just directing resources to where they were needed. And I think that kind of thing of we are directing resources to where they are needed. We're not taking away from anyone else. We're not, I think there is kind of more of the scarcity thing because things are a bit more zero-sum, but you're not taking away from anyone. If support for disabled people doesn't take away from someone else, support for black minority groups doesn't take away from someone else, and a lot of these solutions are shared. So a lot of these sort of problems are shared. Again, it's things like lack of affordable housing, inadequate social security, a lack of fair work. Things like precarious employment. If we improve things there, they improve for everyone. Yes, they'll disproportionately improve for some people, but it does help everyone. And then Tressa, do you have anything?
So again, I think what Shola's saying about specific action, one thing, so mainstreaming does not work for equalities groups, and when you look at the priority family, everybody's in these groups, so we really need to stop just relying on mainstreaming equalities. We need specific and targeted actions, as you're saying. But one thing that we've been thinking about disability justice in that kind of wider perspective is the overlaps, and I think what we've got with these priority families is siloed approaches. So when child poverty, when the Act came in Scotland, I got a phone call right at the outset, so I don't know if these dates correspond, but in 2020, at the outset of lockdown, when they were going hard on these, they were about to go hard on these targets, I got a call to say, we're pulling the funding for your welfare rights project because the big game in town's child poverty. That's absolutely the truth, and we didn't get the project funded after that. I think they then came back in a later year and funded it at some point a few years later just for a year, but that kind of siloed thinking needs to stop. We need to see the interrelations between disability, which is massive. A third of Glasgow's population are disabled and have multiple long-term conditions. We cannot ignore that, and yet, and I always find it fascinating and also heartening that CPAG takes a whole population approach to poverty, to tackling poverty. It doesn't say we're only talking about children. It talks across all the different groups. And I think that's the approach the Scottish Government and others need to take too. But I wouldn't let local authorities off with that, because it was the local authority, it was a councillor who phoned me and gave me that news. And I knew it was short-sighted at the time, told them, you know, they're driven by these imperatives, and I'm not blaming them for that. But I think we need to look wider, and we need to see the intersections of protected characteristics and other issues as well, so that we're actually targeting the person rather than these silos, because that's holding us back from actually delivering the right impact.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a link between the first question and this question, or first question around prevention, second question, or this question around shifting the dial for priority groups. And I can see in the audience that we've got Fife Gingerbread, we've got One Parent Family Scotland, we've got Trussell, who I know are doing some, alongside many others in this room, really important test and demonstration work around prevention, especially for particular priority family groups too. So services is part of the mix here, and we've had 15 years of not responding to the Christie Commission. We've had more recently, you know, what feel a bit faddish, but I hope are not, No Wrong Door, whole family support initiatives. But there is an approach within public service reform that can absolutely be about part of the picture of shifting the dial. The other thing I'd like to say is around premiums within the Scottish Child Payment. So I think JRF, Fraser Valander, IPPR have done a bit of work looking at what next on the Scottish Child Payment. And one of the options is looking at additional spend for either priority family groups or by very low income. And that's where you can get real bang for your buck in terms of the next 5 years around reducing child poverty. And I don't see, and we shouldn't buy into the idea that somehow services are preventative and social security is wasted spend, because obviously if you can prevent poverty in the first place through social security, it has impacts over the way long term. So I think a mix of both is really important, and there's people in this room more expert than me on that.
And just a kind of final point, and this kind of rhetorical, I think, more than, but I mean, I completely get Lynn's question, but there is also a bit of me when I start to hear these things, you kind of want to go, because as you say, it's not a zero-sum game. When you're presenting to people, we need a particular group of support for disabled people. But what about no? Like, stop. And I do think that we get that an awful lot from decision makers of, well, but if we focus on this particular group, what about these? No. I mean, like, when I was in the civil service again, I remember having discussions with some of the finance people about, oh, you're going to spend all this money on the child payment, but you're spending all this money on free school meals or on the attainment challenge or something. Maybe you could take some of that money from there to help pay for it. And it's like, what about the other 50 billion quid that you're spending on other things? So again, to me, it's one of the things that's slightly in that similar bracket of let's kind of not let these ideas in. They should be elbowed out in the same way that we get some of this chat about sustainability of social security spending. Sorry, that's just a bugbear of my own. Jen.
Firstly, I think it's really important to echo the social care point. I'm from Quarriers, so we're one of Scotland's largest health and social care charities. And definitely that shift towards the kind of emergency-based approach and away from prevention is scary. And moving back towards prevention and towards being based within communities and supporting communities and disabled people to live with dignity is the most important part of that for us. I'm really interested from the panel on perhaps both what targeted public investment they would like to see specifically. We've been talking about the fact that third sector providers of social care, for example, often aren't able to recover the whole cost of those services and so can't invest in the future of that, but also then can't invest in the future of the people that we support. So kind of what targeted areas of public investment, but also how do we utilise existing systems, existing resources? We talk a lot about the UNCRC and other frameworks within rights, the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities, but also other actual funding streams and resources like access to work, like adult disability payment, like the Scottish Child Payment, like self-directed support, often where the system's intent may be good, but the delivery isn't actually effective or delivering for the people who actually need it the most. So how we both are delivering the kind of targeted public investment in those areas, but also utilising those existing resources and maybe fixing the frameworks behind them, particularly in areas like SDS. So perhaps where that might be a good balance.
I'll start. So targeted resources, if you were going to target resources for disabled people, I've already said social security benefits, of course. Social care. Social care needs increased investment, and I think the elephant in the room is that we all know that this is going to rely on taxation and better redistribution of wealth, isn't it? So social care would be absolutely tremendous. Again, it's not necessarily about more investment, but can we keep the investment in access to work, please? And can we scrap social care charges? And I'm a bit of a broken record about that, but in relation to things that we have that we could do better, we had hoped that we were going to have incorporation of UNCRPD. It didn't happen. The bill was pulled or paused. So we're hoping that goes back on the table with a human rights bill for Scotland. And the other thing I think that we could do better with, and it's not the people themselves that could do better, but with better investment, the third sector and community sector needs longer term, more meaningful investment, because we're already delivering to plug gaps, as well as the campaigning and lobbying work that we're all doing. I think that needs to be funded in a more long-term, secure way as well.
To continue the trend, I'm going to agree with Tressa, specifically around the kind of importance of long-term sustainable funding for the third sector. There are so many projects. I think as well, when we talk about targeted action for minority ethnic families, often we are looking at the local level. At the national level, there just hasn't been anywhere near enough action that, as I would like to see, or as is needed. But there are projects that you hear about. You go to an event like this and you speak to other people in the third sector, and they talk about these projects that sound amazing, and we're showing really, really good signs of progress. But it was only a year, or it was only 6 months, or it was only, and the project's closed. And a lot of the learning is lost from it. And it means that we're not building as much of an evidence base on what really, really works well, or some of the barriers that can be, they can be mitigated, but not if you're going through 9-month funding cycles and 12-month projects. And it really, really gets in the way. So I don't have as much of a single, point of investment, other than kind of the things I've already said before. But yeah, I would just really, really echo the point that we need to have that kind of continued investment and continued consideration. And although there are major problems with mainstreaming, we need to see if you have any kind of poverty project, what does your service base look like? Does it reflect the population? Does it reflect the population of people in poverty? And if it doesn't, what are we doing? Oh, sorry, and the other thing I would say, sorry, Russell, more than me, is that I would really just emphasize the point that investment and commitment in Black minority ethnic families and in the priority groups, it isn't just a fair weather commitment. It isn't just something that we do when we have all of the resources and we have all of the capacity and we've got oodles of time to think and consider it. And it isn't something that we only do when things are really, really bad. Kind of going back to the first question there, we don't want to get to crisis point, and arguably at 47%. We already are at crisis point, but it isn't something that we just do when we have all of the time in the world, and I don't know if the third sector ever feels like they have had all the time in the world, but it is something we need to be doing now, and going forward, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, because if we don't, I really hope 47% doesn't increase again, but it's certainly possible, and we're just not going to get anywhere close to 10% for anyone.
Yeah, I was just going to, so firstly agree, maybe just to add to that, there's, to me, a mix. So, of course, there's approaches, we need to improve what our services and what the voluntary sector are able to do for everybody, and that will impact on some priority groups. You need to also get targeted support on top of that. As examples of both, so you've mentioned it, around, employability spend, getting confirmed budgets in July, August, September to be spent by April is disastrous. And you can't possibly run an employability service or system like that. That doesn't need extra spend. That needs much better planning and implementation. But you can't do this all through that. There's much more you can sweat that money much more, but you do need additional investment. Some of the things I mentioned were around targeted additional investment into Scottish child payment. I think that's an important place. GRF are doing some really important work around childcare. Again, we need to boost the childcare offer. I think that needs to be focused on low-income families to begin with, at least. And I can see Pregnant Lynn Strood in the audience too. So, there are others, again, working on this really hard. But I think a mix, we can get much more out of the 50 billion or whatever it is that we're spending in Scotland. The additional investment does need to come on top of that. And there's really clear ways to me that that can be targeted.
Great. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. Carla?
I swear it isn't my question. David from the webinar has asked, in terms of public services, where is the investment needed? What benefits could it bring?
Why don't I go quickly first on this one? I mean, I think one of the areas which, frankly, we feel like we haven't got into, I don't know why I'm looking at you, Carla, I speak to you all the time. One of the areas where I feel like we haven't got into it as much, but something we hear constantly is around mental health support, and particularly kind of community mental health support, is we have a system at an acute level which is completely overwhelmed, and that is greatly damaging people's lives. And I think it's causing poverty, it's causing longer term illness, all of these things. So I think having a far more functional mental health support system at a community level would be a really crucial investment, which would be genuinely prevent. Everybody is at risk of mental ill health from time to time. That's fine, but with a lot of illness with early treatment is preventable from getting a lot worse. So I think for me that would be a priority area.
I also just add on the mental health point as well. Being on universal credit, it makes your mental health worse. And isn't systematically when they've looked, I think I want to say it's medical journal. If you're on one of these systems and the kind of level of intrusion into your life and the sort of level of stigma that you're experiencing, because again, it's like stigma with claiming benefits. It isn't innate, doesn't just come out of you. It comes, yes, from society, but it comes from a system that is built to make you get off of it. And that's not as in because you're into genuinely good, decent work. It's because it's so awful being on it. And I would just really say that as well, people's mental health can be so much worse with poverty, and it's the stresses of trying to operate on these shoestring budgets, but it's also these systems that have been built really in that way to make things worse for you. That's perhaps harsher than I mean it to be, but no, not really. But yeah, just add that.
Just on that point as well, part of the findings of our survey is that almost half of those assessed as requiring mental health support say they've been waiting over a year since the point of referral for mental health services, and that's like proper mental health services. It's not like GDA's wellbeing project. So I think, again, going back to the stigma, the hostility, I spoke about the brutality of people's experiences going through previously DWP and still, but now also social work and social care assessments. The impact on disabled people's mental health, and just I think the impact of the system on mental health generally is at an all-time low. People are really, well, sort of all-time high, how much people are struggling. So I think investment in that area would be great. And I do think, again, like earlier we were talking about, the community and third sector has a role to play, and I would be making a particular case for disabled people-led organisations who share the protected characteristics, and the accountability goes back to the members, and what we're doing goes back to the members, and their priorities shape everything we do. So I think that there really needs to be sustained investment in disabled people-led organisations as well.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, but also add to what I said before, and a bit more specific. So again, don't think we can get all the way to where we wish to by just spending the money we already spend better, but we can get some of the way there. If you look at child maintenance system, if we can get much better use of what people are entitled to, if we can get much higher payment rates, for example, we can absolutely make progress towards the child poverty targets, and more broadly, mental health, well-being, financial abuse can all improve. If you look at universal credit, as you say, trust will trust to hear. The food bank usage went through the roof as the 5-week wait was implemented. If you can get rid or reduce the 5-week wait, you can very likely begin to reduce pressure on the system elsewhere. The same applies to conditions and sanctions, to the 2-child limit, so on and so forth. So these are not expensive changes. They don't take lots of money, but they do take effort, and that is where the politicians, I don't think, and maybe us, have put in the effort over the last 5 years. There's plenty more. I said whole family support earlier. I really hope it isn't just words, because that could be absolutely transformative for mental health and other things. They don't just happen to individuals in a household. They happen to everybody. So if you've got services that can respond to that whole family, you can absolutely link them to the right place, not for extra money, but for just spending the existing spend better. But we do need additional spend on top of that. And I think there's opportunities for that, as I've said, not just through spend on social security, but as the UK government spends more money, the Scottish government gets consequentials. And how those are spent, I think, really has to be a focus for us. Ensuring that those are focused on prevention in Scotland could be a massive game changer in terms of our outcomes up here.
And just a quick last thing on that as well. Like, politicians have backed themselves into a corner a bit on this too, because, I mean, Peter said it earlier on, and I absolutely agree. It's like, kind of an argument of this, well, if we're not going to spend money differently, or we're not going to try and raise more money to spend, is this it? Like, is this the best we can do? Of course it's not. And I think how we turn that kind of energy into, I was thinking I had no electricity all week because of it, and there's all these folk running about chopping trees down and putting wires back up to try and get electricity back into houses. That's hard, that's complex, that's difficult, that's people, like if we put that energy into, no pun intended, into some of the things that we want to change, it would be massive. So I don't think we can't let politicians off the hook, because I don't think the public are letting them off the hook now, because I think they are tired of being told one thing and not really seeing any change. We've probably got time for one last question, if anyone's got one. Yeah.
I have a question about the data, if that's okay, slightly technical question. So kind of picking up on the point around how specifically around the racial and ethnic minority families, or racially and ethnically minoritized families, how we kind of homogenize those groups and how that data typically is aggregated. I was wondering, in the analysis, did you have any information in terms of ethnicity breakdown, or also being able to distinguish between families who were British born or families who migrated? Because we've recently published a paper around race and homelessness, and we actually found that those findings still stood even if people were British born. There was an issue of racism per se, as opposed to that being sort of confounded and complicated by migration status as well.
Is it weird that I'm hiding in the audience? Sorry, webinar people. So I would say the key challenge for us is the data is just really, really small. So we already use a 3-year average. Sorry, everyone, this is super boring. But yeah, basically, there is the information there. Theoretically, we can tell really detailed information, like someone saying they're Black Scottish. But that could be one person, could be one household in a year. So it's there's just not enough people to do the analysis to give a reliable bit of information. We can do that at a UK level, and hopefully you'll see some more of that in our UK poverty report. But yeah, really, really disappointing that we can't do that. We can also have a look at people, like their immigration status, and look at that overlap. But again, we can't do that in Scotland because the sample is just too small. So yeah, it's really disappointing. All these things that we could do, but we can't because the data is not available. And so it does need to be a priority. And it's not, as I said, it's not just for minoritized ethnicities, it's also for groups, like increasingly groups that are more common, like we can't dig into in detail. So we can't then look at the drivers of poverty for these families. We can't look at, for example, maybe single parents in working, like children in single parent working households. We can't find out more about them because it's too small. Hopefully that answers your question. I'm happy to talk about it any time.
But I feel really happy for Carla. I've got 2 microphones now. Happy for Carla that we got some stats chat at the end there. So look, we're about to finish this part of the event. We'll be saying goodbye to our friends online shortly. But before I say the last couple of words, I'd just like you to join me in thanking my brilliant panel and Carla and our colleagues for helping us with the online questions. So, as I say, we'll say goodbye to the online folk first. I would really encourage you, if you've got the time, have a read through the report today. If you've got any questions about it, all of our details are online. Please do reach out to us. You can talk sample size, multi-year sample size for as long as you possibly want with Carla. If you've got any ideas, any bits of it that you don't agree with or you're confused by, do please reach out to us, because as I said at the beginning, we really are going into an important period of the next 6 months in the run up to this election, and we can't finish without mentioning Scotland Demands Better, which Peter mentioned at the beginning. This for us is a really key part of us all raising our voices together, to raise the temperature on the targets, to demand action and to demand the things which frankly don't sound like too much. Decent public services, jobs you can pay the bills, decent affordable homes, these things. So it's really important for us to show solidarity, to raise our voices. So if you are able at all, do try and join us all on the 25th of October. So we'll say goodbye to our online folk. Thank you so much for coming.